All right, yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thanks everyone for sticking around until almost the end of this super interesting day. So what I'm presenting is a paper that's work co-authored with Jane Gingrich at Oxford and Jasmine Bhatia at Birkbeck. And the background, what got us started is, well, as many of you know and many of you have actually worked on, we have a lot of growing body of research on sort of the impact of automation risk on redistributive and regulatory preferences, but we don't really know yet whether it works the same for generative AI. And so we went into this project with the underlying assumption that Tobias thankfully just substantiated, that exposure to technology is a factor that sort of contributes to subjective risk. So the study we ran a survey experiment where we did not just provide people with an information treatment, but actually had them use generative AI, ChatGPT themselves in some tasks, and then looked at their performance in a different paper, and now at these outcomes about regulatory and social policy preferences. So quickly on the theoretical background, generally speaking, the existing literature on automation, risk, and policy preferences relies on what we call a risk insurance framework. We've heard quite a bit about this already, focusing on the material aspects of this question, and basically argues that individuals who are exposed to technology are to some extent aware of their risk and then correspondingly demand policies that insure them against this risk. So there isn't really a consensus in this literature, but there is a tendency in the evidence there to find that people show stronger support for compensatory policies over like activating or social investment policies. These differences may reflect of different methodological choices, looking at subjective, objective risk, different country contexts, labor market, and social policy institutions, so various different factors. But yeah, so the tendency goes towards finding more support for compensatory policies. Most of this work is non-experimental, but there are a number of experimental studies too, some of them conducted by people here in this room. And most of these studies have used information treatments, which also tend to show mixed findings. We actually mostly find little evidence for an effect on policy preferences, but for social policy preferences, but for technological regulation. So we don't have a settled debate here, but a dominant narrative sort of is emerging, and if we were to transpose this onto generative AI, we would the implication would be that people who are exposed to this new technology would might consider themselves at higher risk of the job being automated, and therefore demand higher social protection. This is what we initially assumed, what we pre-registered, but of course there are some other factors that may come into play as well, and we've heard quite a bit already about sociotropic preferences and mechanisms today, and we're sort of going into a similar direction with that. So one point to mention about our studies, while we're looking at early adopters of ChatGPT, even though not everyone in our sample has been a sort of prolific user of the technology before our study, just by definition of this being conducted last July, they are likely to be among the early adopters and sort of consider themselves likely to be among the winners. And, well, we know from studies, for example, from Aina and colleagues, that the winners tend to support the status quo. So our expectation here in this, following this line of reasoning, is that these people would actually, after being exposed, feel more efficacious, seeing their productivity rise, and develop more positive attitudes towards generative AI. And then when it comes to social policy preferences, this might actually be shaped by what they think might happen to others, to the anticipated losers from this new technology. And we know from the literature about deservingness that people are more supportive of supporting the unemployed, people who are struggling when it's not their fault. So when there's an external shock that makes people unemployed, people are more sympathetic towards supporting them than when it's quote unquote their fault. And similarly, there's research showing that there are negative externalities to inequality or more extremely poverty. So it might, even if you expect to be on the winning side of generative AI, you might want to make sure that those who lose don't lose too badly, because there are negative consequences to that. So this would then lead us to expect sociotropic preferences for more generous social policy and sort of, generally speaking, left-wing political orientations there. So here's this briefly schematized on top. This is sort of the classic narrative. AI use of the technology exposure through the perceived risk leads to more positive, so the increased perceived risk leads to more negative general attitudes and more redistributive social policy preferences. And the narrative we put against this is that the AI use, by boosting people's productivity and increasing their efficacy, actually leads to more positive attitudes. At the same time, concern for the potential losers leads to more redistributive social policy preferences. So a few details about the survey that we ran. It was an experimental survey with just over 1,000 workers fielded in the UK last July, and it's like a near representative sample of ChatGPT users. So I say near representative because these, even though we used YouGov, which is sort of the biggest survey company in the UK, we could only use people who had already had a ChatGPT account for privacy reasons. And so from the sample of ChatGPT account, people with ChatGPT account that YouGov had, it wasn't possible to get a fully representative sample along the gender, occupational, educational lines, but so they tried their best, let's say. The experimental component was 3 text-based tasks that are sort of realistic tasks that many people can expect to, in similar form, experience in their working life. And so our reasoning here was that this sort of direct exposure should more directly and better highlight the capabilities of ChatGPT in relation to their personal work situation than sort of a classic information treatment. So we think that with this we have a sort of a better claim to external validity than other types of interventions. And we should also say that unlike other studies that also David just mentioned that look at specific single occupational groups, one of our reasons for doing this was to look at a general population sample. And then we have a couple of outcome measures. First, the subjective automation risk, and then the general attitudes, social policy preferences, political orientation, and then we had an open-ended question at the end that we do some text analysis on. Okay, so let's get into the outcomes at the top. So this is just a simple treatment effects. The top 2 effects are the subjective risk measures. So they are from the OECD, adapted from the OECD Risks That Matter survey. The likelihood of using a job to a human who is more skilled with the technology and losing the job to technology directly, to AI, automation, and so on. And we see no effect. So this kind of already at the first step of reasoning of this, so the traditional narrative, this kind of falls apart here. But at the same time, then our 4 general attitude questions, people actually develop more positive views. So when we ask them whether they think they are personally going to benefit from AI, and whether they think in general AI has more benefits or drawbacks. And then we see sort of 7 to 9 percentage point increase in the likelihood of saying, of agreeing with this. At the same time, we see a similar sized reduction in agreement with statements that the government should limit the use of some forms of AI, or that the existential risk argument that AI is a serious threat to humanity. So if anything, people develop more positive attitudes, supporting the first element of our sociotropic argument. And then looking at social policy preferences, we have here top 3 questions about the role of government in social policy. They are adapted from the ESS, European Social Survey, whether it's the government's responsibility to provide unemployment benefits, provide jobs for people who want them, and provide training opportunities for people who want them. And remember, we've seen in the previous slide that people don't become more worried about themselves. Yet at the same time, they become more supportive of these policies that presumably they don't think they'll need. So this suggests to us that they perhaps anticipate difficulties for other groups they think might lose out. So this is why we call it the sociotropic model. And another interesting finding here in the context of the existing automation risk literature is that here we actually find the strongest and most clearly significant effect for government provision of training, which is sort of classic social investment, active labor market policy, which in the previous literature looking at sort of the traditional automation was sort of the opposite of what we sort of used to find for earlier technological change. And sort of in line with this, we also ask people to place themselves on the left-right wing scale, and they move slightly to the left. So I should say we have some. So we looked at some heterogeneous effects as well by gender and education mainly. There's some evidence that the sociotropic effects are mainly driven by men, even though it's interesting. Even the women tend to be less exposed to AI, at least at this stage. And with regard to education, there's some evidence for some convergence, but also because of for power reasons, this is not super robust or super strong. Okay, so let's move on to the text analysis. At the end of the survey, we included an open-ended question here, asking people to briefly tell us what they think is most important when it comes to dealing with the effects of AI on the labor market. So the idea here was to just get some complementary insights into how people reason about these things, and also get some ideas really for future studies, what's important for us to look at. So this was at the end of a fairly long and cognitively demanding survey, yet people gave, in the majority, surprisingly thoughtful answers. It was a really useful exercise. Some of them in the treatment group seem to have enjoyed using ChatGPT so much that they also used ChatGPT to answer this question. So we did our best to identify and exclude those with a triangulation approach. Using similarity scores, AI detection software, and a qualitative review. This concerns about 40 cases in total. And then we perform a sentiment analysis to see differences in overall sentiment around AI, and a structural topic model to identify the latent themes and differences in emphasis between the groups. So the sentiment analysis, we see overall slightly positive sentiment around AI, and no difference between the treatment and control group, after excluding the people who used ChatGPT to answer the question itself. So this slightly biases our findings downward, as these people, well, if we kept the AI answers in, AI likes itself, so they were kind of positive, but I would also argue that the people who use AI to answer this question are likely to be positively disposed towards AI. So this is probably sort of a lower bound of the sentiment in the treatment group. So overall, people are cautiously optimistic about AI. Topic model, we settled on three topics. specification with three topics, the first of which sort of revolves around the need for adaptation and intervention to deal with job losses. So this is where people mention retraining policies and income support and things like that. So the average loading on this topic is pretty much 0.33. So you would a second topic deals answers that load heavily on that topic revolve around safety and ethics concerns, so alongside the benefits. So these people tend to say, oh yeah, this can be great, this can be useful, but we have to be careful. And the third and strongest topic really is about the technical limitations of the current AI technology. And so people's answers in this that fall into this category, or load heavily on this category, are skeptical about the capability of current AI technology to really replace humans at scale. So interestingly, when we regress the prevalence of these topics on the treatment status, the treated respondents were less likely to mention topic 1 about adaptation, and more likely to mention topic 3 about the limits. So this is maybe a bit surprising, given that they don't seem to consider themselves at more risk. But on the other hand, on the other hand, these people, so these people, even though they don't think that they are themselves at risk, but they support higher social support for the potential losers, but at the same time, like, they don't think this is going to be hugely disruptive, perhaps. All right, so it's time for me to wrap up. One takeaway from this, I think, is that sort of theories that look only at material factors, at least at this stage, when it's still unclear what the overall labor market impact will be, offer only limited insights, and we have to also consider non-material factors. There's an interesting change compared to previous waves of automation, in that active labor market policies are see more support here. And just, I think, these kinds of exposure treatments are an interesting alternative to information treatments that we have seen so much in the literature. All right, we have a few ideas how we want to take this further and follow up on this study to sort of iron out some of the problems that there still are, but I think I've already gone 2 minutes over time, so I'll leave it at that. You see a link if you're interested in the paper, and I look forward to to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this paper. I actually read Italo and Aina's paper first, and then read this one. I felt like those are really related papers, and I think that's from tomorrow, just to flag that. But in reading the other paper on ChatGPT, they really emphasize the idea of the treatment being realistic. And then in this paper, in the writing, it also emphasizes that the work task is also realistic. But then you also emphasize a lot about how this is a representative survey. And so I'm thinking, like, what is a realistic task like for a general population? Because, I can ask ChatGPT about cows. Like, it will be realistic for some groups of people, but not for me per se. So I was just wondering if you can tell us more about the treatment.
I'm going to take a couple just.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. A very interesting project. Like, you have a set of very interesting findings, but I wanted to push you to tell us a bit more about how to interpret some of these findings. Like, for example, the effect on right-wing leaning. Why is that? Like, what's your explanation? I guess it makes sense that it maps onto the other dimension, especially in the UK, is a context in which right-left is still, very much on at least partially on the first dimension. So it makes sense that it's consistent with the other findings that you have. But yeah, I just wondering why. What's your explanation?
One more and then. This is such a fascinating study, and I have some questions about what you hope to do in the future. So you said that in this study, only people who have ChatGPT accounts can participate, right? I guess I was just wondering, now that some other researchers like David Rand and others have been able to integrate ChatGPT into, like, the API call into their Qualtrics survey or whatever survey platform they're using, I think that might open it up to like a bigger audience. And yeah, I was just, what would your expectations be for folks who are maybe not that technologically advanced and hadn't used ChatGPT before, and then all of a sudden they are able to, you know, pull it up in their online survey? Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what your hypotheses are for those people. Thank you.
Should I answer this? Yeah. Yeah, thanks. All three really great questions. I'll start in order of Nicole's about how realistic is our treatment. So in designing this, we tried to come up with tasks that at least structurally are similar to things that most people will encounter at some point. So the first task was sort of a poorly written email in a professional context, and it was to revise this email. And this is something that even if you're a craftsman or so, you might sometimes have to do a task like this, right? Almost everybody writes emails. We also ask people how often or whether they encounter similar tasks in their work life, and for all tasks, most people said at least sometimes they do these tasks. The second task was about assessing arguments. So gave them 2 excerpts from articles on the same topic, taking opposing positions, and you could argue for either one of the texts being more convincing, but you had to sort of make a reasoned case for that, which is also maybe not in this form that everybody does this, but almost everyone has to sort of sometimes weigh arguments. And the final task was simply a complex text comprehension. This was something that we adapted from the LSAT. So while it's not everybody's everyday tasks, we tried our best so to come up with things that most people could expect to encounter. And so we have ideas for how we can expand this range of tasks in follow-up studies. But they are always open for suggestions, obviously, for things that maybe we're not covering at this point. About the interpretation of our findings, and mainly the right wing, I think this is really mostly about being sort of consistent with what people said before. So the right wing, left wing question came after the social policies question, and while they were sort of in these question blocks, they were internally randomized, but the right wing question, left wing, right wing question always came after the social policy. So I think people probably answered that, and then being like, okay, if I support unemployment benefits and retraining policies, that seems to me to be a more left-wing position. So I think this is mainly about consistency, but I think the finding that people do support these more generous social policies cannot be chalked up to sort of a striving for internal consistency, because it's like, yeah, it's somewhat of a surprising finding, right? So, and this is, I think, where the sociotropic concerns come in and sort of give the best explanation that we have for this at this point. And Bao, you're spot on about what you said. Integrating ChatGPT into the follow-up is top of our list to get a really properly representative full population sample. We couldn't do it at the time but we're now in talks also with YouGov to make it possible to do this. And what we would expect once this happens. So obviously currently there's some element of there's an element of selection into this study. At the same time, a large share of these people seem to have made a ChatGPT account at one point, but then never used it. We asked people whether they're frequent users, and only 20% or so were. And we see actually in the other study that we did, based where we looked at performance on these tasks, that people who are frequent users had the biggest performance boost. So there seems to be an element of familiarity and skill involved. So, and from this, I think we can derive expectations for what will happen when we go to the really general population, where people then don't have, where we can integrate it directly and don't have to even set up their own ChatGPT account. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Matthias.